Welcome to the Heritage is Living podcast, a place to explore and challenge what heritage is and how it fits into our world today. Through this podcast, we'll speak with experts in the heritage field and beyond to understand how heritage can help us to live aware, with care, and with purpose. This podcast is recorded in Ottawa on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Trust works on the lands and territories of many Indigenous peoples across what is now known as Canada. I'm your host, Patricia Kell, Executive Director of the National Trust for Canada. On this episode, we are discussing the economic potential of heritage conservation with Glen Murray. As an urban strategist, Glen Murray is best known for his vision to build culturally dynamic urban centers. He was a two-term mayor of the City of Winnipeg and was the first chair of the Big City Mayors Caucus in 2002. He was also the chair of the National Roundtable on the Environment and Economy under Prime Ministers Martin and Harper. As president and CEO of the Canadian Urban Institute, Glen led the development of new tools for financing municipal infrastructure. Glen founded Authenticity, a practice to help communities understand and achieve culture-led regeneration of places and spaces. He held 5 cabinet portfolios in the Ontario government and was a fellow in the Faculty of Architecture and Landscape Design and a distinguished visitor at Massey College at the University of Toronto. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks very much. It's great to be with you, Patricia.
So I'd like to start off today talking a little bit about you. So you have had a career that is dedicated to communities, dedicated to public service. How did you get into that?
Oh my God. I was living well, I guess I could start. I was 10 years old and I went to Expo 67 in Montreal. And I lived there under the Drapeau years when the subway was being built. And a lot of things were happening. Old Montreal was being revitalized. People were really just, it was sort of the 60s. The heritage movement in Montreal was very, very caught up as part of the economic movement. And Expo 67 popped up and I fell in love with city building. I could not believe people who don't remember it, they built basically a 21st century city and a 20th century city on the waterfront right across from one of the most oldest and historic areas. And I think at that point, I just fell in love with city building and architecture, and that continued through my life. And when I was living in Winnipeg, Winnipeg has downtown as a National Historic District. It reminded me a lot of Montreal. And it was one of the few cities that had really was trying to celebrate through Corey initiatives and heritage. And in the middle of all of that, I met Jane Jacobs when I was a city councillor, and she and I started a lifelong friendship to the very end of her life. And we started collaborating about what were the fundamentals that made healthy cities and made cities work. And I read The Death and Life of American Cities and her understanding of place and authenticity and placemaking. And then that got me involved in that as in the public sector, as a city councillor, as a mayor, and then in politics in Ontario as Minister of Infrastructure, Transportation, Environment, Climate Change, universities and colleges, all kinds of portfolios that brought me into direct work in the built environment. And I got really interested in why at this point, when we know more about cities and have a greater understanding of them, are we arguably building worse cities than we ever had before? And why are we unable to distinguish between the investments we make in cities that cost us more, do not build our tax base, build our tax burden, and are generating and fueling the climate crisis with the kinds of buildings and transportation systems that we're building, and how we are so over specialized in all the ways we looked at cities that we've diced it all up and disaggregated it, that we have most of the people in that urban city building space, knowledge is a kilometer deep and a centimeter wide, and we don't take a holistic approach. We have a housing crisis. We have a congestion and transportation crisis. We have an environmental crisis. We have a violence and gun crisis in our cities. And I can go on and on with the crises, and none of them are really true. in the sense that what we have is a city building problem.
So, I mean, you've just listed a bunch of very significant issues for contemporary cities, and yet in your career, you've been a strong advocate for heritage. So how do you see heritage in balance with all those other real priorities?
Well, I see it as part of them. I mean, it's this idea that everything is an integrated system. You know, it's my friend David Crombie, one of Toronto's, maybe one of the best mayors in Canada, he used to always start every speech by saying, you have to understand that everything is connected to everything else. And another fellow I do a lot of work with, a guy named Bill Reed, who runs a practice called Regenesis, which looks at regenerative design, talks about, you have to go back, well, he would say hundreds of millions of years, I'll settle for thousands, to understand how people live together and what's working in a city and what's not working. And most of my contact with the heritage movement was somewhat frustrating because it's a lot of folks who want to preserve buildings. And the assumption is that government has to put money into preserving buildings. And it's the only real estate portfolio I know of that people actually assume is a liability and losing money and extricate it from the ecosystem. One of the things that I think the heritage movement unintentionally has done has disconnected the historic building of cities from the larger urban conversation at a time when that is most important because our existing built environment is critical. And in some ways, the word heritage is a bit obsolete because the existing building environment is all part of our cultural foundation, expressed in different ways, much like modern art and historic art. It's art. It is identity. It is narrative. It is what gives us a sense of place. And we look at the buildings individually. We don't look at the cultural, economic, social, and infrastructural landscapes that they are part of. And so one of the most important things to preserve is walkable cities. And, up until the 1940s or 1950s, almost everything we built and the buildings that we built successfully to work in that were all walkable. We now talk about what is a walkable city. Well, it's the largest movement in urbanism right now is Jeff Speck and walkable cities. He's making a lot of money telling people how to build cities like we did 50, 80, and 100 years ago. And he's talking a lot about, everyone's talking about mid-rise buildings. Well, what is most of our heritage environment? The vast majority of it is walkable blocks and heritage buildings. So there's a larger ethos of understanding scale and design and understanding the design elements. Because the last little piece I would talk about was really interesting is that there's this whole other modern movement with software, and I'm sure it's going to accelerate with AI, about biometrics. So there's a lot of studies being done right now, not really applied to city planning yet, about how you and I, Patricia, would see and experience a building. And what have they discovered? Well, 80-meter blocks, mid-rise buildings, human scale, but also the facial and natural forms of buildings. So the historic building, most of the things that are on our national preservation lists and conservation lists are buildings that have almost facial expressions to them. Like we actually know there is a forms of nature, of bringing nature into architecture and forms of architecture that make us feel safe and comfortable and welcoming. And there are forms of buildings that make us feel alien and cold. And so if you want walkable streets that are healthy for commerce, and you want people to feel safe and good, you want tourism, you want to understand what good architecture is. Good architecture is, a lot of it is in the eye of the human beholder. So we haven't translated that into an ongoing narrative about taking that knowledge of how we built buildings so long, when we built them successfully, and looking at why so much of heritage today, what I call, sticky note heritage, where you tear down all the buildings, you gut them, and you take the facade, which has been dismantled, and you stick it like a sticky note on the front of a glass tower, and not understanding that. That sort of is the reductionist approach of where we've landed with heritage. That it's all about saving the look of something, and it basically has become facadism. In Toronto, I would say 3/4 of the buildings that have been so-called preserved are simply facades stuck to glass towers, in downtown Toronto.
So let's go back and talk a little bit about work that you did when you were mayor of Winnipeg on the Winnipeg Exchange District, because there you really leaned in on the existing heritage buildings and created something remarkable.
Well, we actually saved them so what happened was there was a couple of things. One is the core of the National Historic Site there, which is the largest collection of what are called, often referred to as Chicago-style buildings. They're really mostly late Victorian and Edwardian buildings. There's Bankers Row, which is very famous on Main Street, which was 13, now 11 major bank skyscrapers, because Winnipeg did have, prior to the First World War, that first wave of skyscrapers. Winnipeg had 16 of them. You couldn't count more than that number on one hand, and all the other cities put together at that time. And so there's Bankers Row, and then there's Newspaper Row, which was a lot of mid-rise, and then there's the Warehouse District, right? So what we did is we actually looked at what was the urban ecosystem. So we created precincts, and we looked at identifying that. And in the first instance, we created about 3 precincts. The recent study we just finished about a year ago created 7 new precincts. And heritage, in most of those precincts, the dominant part of the built environment are heritage buildings, certainly mostly existing buildings, obviously, but really a large, probably a higher percentage in those. They're about 10, 20 block areas. And we looked at how they were working and where there was a need for new buildings and how would height work. But we also looked at what were the sustainability metrics, because the most greenest buildings are the ones that already exist. So how do you look at it systemically of how you restore buildings? What's working? We discovered that 80% of the businesses, and certainly almost all the street level businesses, were in 20% of the area of the Exchange District, which was interesting. So we figured out that was within really one of the 7 precincts, had most of it. And we looked at what were the characteristics of that. And so when you actually look at historic buildings, not just for their heritage qualities, but how do they promote safety? These buildings had storefronts that buildings don't often have anymore. There were wide sidewalks, so there were lots of patios there. They were well lit. They were completely used. They had upper floors. All the blocks were 80 meters or less. I could go on, but all of the physical characteristics and the fact that we had mostly two-way streets and not one-way streets, and the width of the streets and the way that the old historic lighting standards worked and their scale. We had laneways and we had drayways and we had all kinds of things that weren't included in more modern city buildings and other parts of the downtown where the blocks were longer, the streets were one way, the building heights were different. That we discovered that what we had in the Heritage District was a 15-minute city. All of the things that the James Howard Kunstler's and the Jane Jacobs and the Richard Floridas and others argue about the creative city, the walkable city, the safe city, the dynamic city, the heritage city, were all present in that. And that we had lost that. So we were really interested in, so when you look at the 7 precincts, a lot of it was taking the knowledge that we found in the 20% of the space and look at the other 80% of the Exchange District and the shoulder adjacent neighborhoods that were included in the study, and figured out, we came up with 40 indicators of sustainability that really came out of heritage that would be applied not just to heritage buildings and that block, but the whole area. We came out with economic metrics looking at what created and what conditions supported office, commercial, residential. We had in the first study that we did back when I was mayor on the waterfront, we actually built mid-rise residential and a roadway through an abandoned rail line on the waterfront. And even though that wasn't a heritage project, the massive number of large historic heritage warehouses that were along there, the Victorian Edwardian warehouses, had a 68% vacancy rate. When we finished the waterfront plan, the infill development, the new infrastructure, we redid the laneways. We had a reasonable incentive for heritage buildings, but the vacancy rate dropped down to 6 or 7%. And then building owners said they were making money, but we weren't looking at saving heritage buildings. We were looking at understanding the ecosystem and what was missing and how do we see buildings and neighborhoods as living things that continue to grow and improve and change. But how do you also have a healthy tension with the preservation of character, place, architectural significance and integrity. And when you put all of that together and you do it at a precinct level, then you can solve all the problems. And what's interesting is those heritage buildings, not one of them required really any kind of significant subsidy. The project was so successful, I would say the outputs were a whole bunch of new infrastructure and some preserved and restored buildings, but the outcomes were a total change in perception of this being a high crime neighborhood with high vacancies, very small residential population, and very little commercial activity, to now, I would argue, probably the most desirable neighborhood to live in Winnipeg is the historic East Exchange waterfront. And once the conditions had changed and the roadways and the infrastructure and all the parks and parkways and waterfronts, the place is full of restaurants now. And without any subsidy, all kinds of other infill development came in. And this is where it gets interesting, because the question, let me, in the last 10 years in Winnipeg, 18 buildings, new buildings went into the Exchange District. Guess how many of them were associated of the 18 with heritage buildings? 15. And what's associated, I mean, they were new buildings attached to historic buildings, and they were very green. As a matter of fact, the greenest buildings in the Americas are all in the Exchange District. And if you're ever looking for the classic example of how you do this right, there's some private sector examples over on the waterfront, but Red River College, Polytechnic, RCCP, has built the greenest building, arguably in the world, the new Indigenous Research Center, using the old Scott Fruit Warehouse, which was an old Edwardian warehouse, and the original grain exchange. And so that whole collection of buildings, and the Union Bank Tower, which is a skyscraper, all part of this campus. But the other 14 also used other existing heritage buildings. And what they did is they built a modern building that was distinctly modern, did not try to be fake heritage, but there is what I call a vocabulary to historic buildings and scale. So they used modern materials and they captured the vocabulary and the scale of the buildings. And they used the fact that what engineers today ironically call over-engineered heritage buildings, because the walls are so thick and they're made of tyndall stone and granite and stuff, that the buildings were perfect. They had the perfect shells to be basically a passive house building, and they were beautiful. So they found expressions of really beautiful modern architecture to attach beside the building. So the building benefited from all of this new cleaner tech, passive house, heating, cooling, photovoltaics, but it didn't interfere with the fabric of the building. And the new building was much more successful because it had all this incredible interior space and the beauty of the heritage building as part of it. And there were 15 of the 18 buildings that were successful in arguably one of Canada's poorest downtowns with the least amount of development pressure compared to the Vancouvers and Torontos. You had heritage leading 80% of the infill development would not have happened without the economics of a heritage building, and would not have happened had we not planned it out on a precinct level and had a learning, living, growing model of heritage in the context of a community, and that the buildings that we had to create should be heritage buildings. I mean, why would we not designate them? They are as unique and as beautiful as the old buildings they're beside. And I can bet you on those 15 buildings, there will be committees in 100 years formed to save them if they're ever in trouble, which I can't say a lot about much of what we built in the last 30 or 40 years. So that's but it's how do you break down these walls? You know, like when they had the conference in Winnipeg, I was trying to get a walking tour to show all these. I couldn't get support from your organization, sadly, to do that. And I was saying to them, like, you know, the developers want to be part of this. They're the ones who are actually saving your buildings, not the government, not my tweedy, lovely academic friends at University of Winnipeg who give the most passionate speeches to City Council, and they are a blessing on my soul and on our city. But they don't. But they don't understand the economics of it. And so someone like Bryce Alston, who saved the Porter Building, all of these folks who do it, they have to be part of our movement, and they're afraid of us, and we're afraid of them. And so, you know, I think building those bridges and how we define heritage and how we define who the people are and what the questions are is really important, especially now, because CBRE is now wants to change, the big real estate firm that basically defines real estate, wants to change the way we classify buildings from A, B, and C to viable and not viable. And they had a big conference recently in Chicago, and they flashed up the buildings in downtown. As you can imagine, many of them were heritage. And they're basically saying, with climate change and with all of the new changes and that are going to change in building technology, because we're not going to have fossil fuel, we're not building concrete, we want to classify buildings as basically viable or unviable. So how do we make sure that our heritage buildings are not a whole bunch of stranded assets set up for demolition, because they're now part of the conversation about the whole change post-COVID in downtowns and offices, the way we work, the way we use space is very important. I'll shut up. I'm now going on longer than I probably need to be. So.
No, it's all wonderful. I just wanted to sort of pause before we move on and look at some of those issues that you've just raised. So I think if I'm hearing you correctly, what I hear is that the success of the Exchange District project depended on several things. So one was an ability to look at what the existing housing stock or the existing building stock that was there, and to see in it the qualities that you wanted in your modern city. So rather than wanting to start from a blank slate, actually having a vision of what an excellent city is, and seeing that what you had there was already tending in that direction, or had good bones for making that happen. And then the second piece was making wise investments or wise additions to what was already there in order to support communities and neighborhoods, economic units that could function in the modern context. So judicious choices about, I think, both where private investment went, but also where public investment went in order to make these communities work.
Right, but it was also two things that were very difficult. They were very difficult for everyone to understand because no one believed them. And we as human beings often default to our belief systems, which are irrational, rather than evidence, science, and looking at that. And the hard thing is to see them as buildings, that not as museums. And maybe there's some cause to have some buildings to be thought of as museums, but the vast majority of them probably not. And what I would say is that, so we had a college, so we had this whole block that had been sitting there for 30 years. It was the original Sainted Grain Exchange, which you can imagine is the most historic heritage building because it was the foundational building for the city. It was the original Commodities Grain Exchange. And there had been a fire there. One of the buildings had been torn down. There were 4 of the original Chamber of Commerce. And so that row on Princess, which was so elegantly across from the ugliest parking garage owned by the City of Winnipeg, which they plunked across the street, was basically a dead street. I mean, when you put a parkade on a full city block across from your arguably most precious, oldest historic buildings, you are really destroying their economic viability. So one of the things we said, so even if it's a college, it has to be economically viable, right? Like this has to work. And so how do we deal with this? And we have to build for climate change. So this has to be as close as we can to a net zero building. So the decision was to go beyond facade. So the entirety of most of the buildings that could be saved that weren't, but one of the buildings, which was really quite interesting, was the Commodities Exchange building, because the floor of the Commodity Exchange was on the 2nd or 3rd floor of a 4-story building. It was a very narrow building, and it was sort of intact, but it wasn't sustainable, and the floor underneath had been burnt out and things had collapsed. So the facade of the building is there. The main floor is there. The 2nd floor is all modern. And through GPS, with I think a steel structure, they recreated the 3rd floor. It's almost suspended behind the facade, and it's restored. And then new buildings were put in there, and the old laneway, and then we're across the street with the Scott Fruit Factory, fruit warehouse. The same thing happened. So what was happening was it involved a lot of work to look at this to be a new purpose building. It wasn't going to be a commodities exchange anymore, but we would preserve the elements of it. And that is an example of working through a living building. So most of the buildings are intact, not all of them. all of them have more than facades. They have leveraged all kinds of other development and recently led the city to finally tear down the parkade and build a beautiful extension to the campus and affordable housing across the street, reflecting upon the scale, dimensions, and form of that block. And what that heritage cluster has done is it saved the Union Bank Tower, which became the next major project, and it introduced into North America the first use of photovoltaic skins. It is one of the largest photovoltaic arrays in Canada. It is arguably probably the greenest buildings in Canada. And while they are the oldest viable and still existing major commercial buildings in the city, they are also the most modern, green, and the only truly net zero building probably in Canada is this cluster of heritage buildings. So it was innovation driven, but it was done not just because it was on site. It was the anchor, that cluster, for what was called the Education and Innovation Precinct. So the whole area around it was scoped out, mapped. We measured everything. And one of the secret things about this, and if I sort of have to, what is the foundation of all of that? It's what we call foundational projects. So when we looked at the college, or we looked at these heritage buildings, and we looked at a whole bunch of other commercial investments, residential investments were going on, each of them was evaluated for support and prioritization based not only on their own merit to the building itself, but how were they foundational to other buildings? So that whole college, each of the buildings, and selecting the uses for the buildings was looking at all of the other things. We put free transit service in the area for college students as part of that, because that made sense to support greater transit use overall, even though that route was free. And we looked at how that college would actually allow us to have a cafe district and some housing in the area and some art galleries. So we not put the students down there, we wouldn't have got the product. So we have beautiful restaurants and cafes all around there. The neighborhood's very walkable. We have residential development there. We have some excellent art galleries. But we looked at measuring all of the possible uses in the planning process based on how they would work together. So it was not site specific, it was precinct specific. And one of the first things we do is we measure the walk shed. We measure all kinds of things about distances. We try to understand what are the mobility issues, how does proximity and connectivity play in this area? What would work, what wouldn't work? When these buildings had value originally, what were the conditions that were in place that gave them value? Well, they didn't have a huge parking lot across the street. That was where this group of buildings had most of the agricultural implements manufacturers and suppliers there. So how do we recreate that ecosystem on the street? Now, it's not that complicated. I mean, as soon as you say it, people eyes go, oh, yeah, who has the time to do that in every block in Canada? But it's not that hard. And the study we just finished did it for 200 blocks and an area twice the size of the Exchange District, created 7 precincts, and that's all done. But, right now, that book has become a coffee book because no one knows how to use it. The heritage community doesn't understand it. The city planning department is under-resourced and doesn't bring, as Jane Jacobs picked up, doesn't bring place into economics. We still don't. The basic fundamental lesson of Jane Jacobs, everyone quotes her. She's the foundational book in planning schools. We still don't use the very basic elements of what she talked about. So heritage is one of the most defining characteristics of place. It's actually a very value-laden concept that has a lot of restrictions on it about how one of the lenses we look through place. How do we break out of it so that it's a doorway into a larger conversation and not a tunnel, which limits our view? And I think that's the challenge.
So that's great. So let's move on and talk about what the barriers are to making heritage places an attractive investment, or attractive to ensure that we have them as part of our urban fabric. So I want to come back to the comment you said that people in heritage and developers are enemies. And so what would we need to do in order to befriend them?
Well, first invite them to the party. I mean, it's not that complicated. I mean, this is it. I would say this is the template. Here's the manual for how to do it. And there's about 800 pages of appendices that show you how you do that. It's not hard. This was done in Hamilton with a project called Building Momentum, which was a more basic version of this. It was done in Guelph, and it was done in Uptown St. John. But this is after 30 years of my life of doing that, and it really puts together principles. And I really and heritage is one of the three foundational pieces: authenticity of place, character of place, heritage, culture. And residential development is the other, and mobility, which is really about the mobility equals product, proximity plus connectivity. We always forget about the proximity part. But this is really a model for how you take, and now is it a heritage study? Not in a literal sense. Could you do this on an area that did not have a lot of buildings that would fall in a reasonably classical definition of historical? Yeah, you could do it anywhere. But when you do this in a historic area, you basically shift the conversation from seeing heritage buildings as critically vital assets that generate value and wealth and cause uplift in value versus being a problem that requires subsidy. So the foundation of what we call value planning, which is the underpinning of this, and which is the underpinning of the heritage buildings policy, was value uplift. We put in probably $10 million worth of $10 to $12 million worth of new infrastructure, roads and things in that area, lighting, street lighting, some public art, and about $8 million in different incentives to correct problems after the old steam plant got torn down and 12 of these major warehouses lost their heating cooling system. So there was somebody that went in to replace that because that was a municipal responsibility. But I think for every dollar we put that went into the East Exchange District, we had 8. Like we put about $10 million into hard capital costs, and I think the net growth in tax base within a few years was $80 million a year that came in every year. And no one ever calculates that. I mean, no one ever actually calculates what would the value of land be without these heritage buildings. Does it really cost very much in incentives to actually restore them? Are they not really actually, especially in the 21st century, the green buildings because they're already built and they're built out of natural, durably, locally sourced material, and just tearing them down, the embedded energy makes no sense at all. So, but you can't look at them singularly. You can't look at them on off, and you can't look at them on. You have to look at how do they, because the biggest thing, where heritage buildings create most of their wealth. Most of these buildings now make money and they're very successful. But where they really define the area is that they create value for other buildings. They make other land more valuable. And I was absolutely shocked when I saw the uplift in property assessment, because when we took the hoarding off one of these old boarded up buildings, an old bank building or an old office or warehouse, a warehouse in the sense of the Victorian meaning of the word, Richardsonian Romanesque et al. What happened was all of the other buildings came up. One of the biggest things to reduce crime rates and to increase property value is put patios out. So looking at the storefronts and where a lot of these shops were, they are the perfect coffee shops. I mean, there's what Starbucks tries to imitate. The Starbucks experience is really an old-fashioned wood, natural materials, comfy kind of, that. So it's that whole idea of how they can restore vitality, commercial viability, walkability. One of the things, and the importance of active storefronts, because most heritage buildings, not all, but most have active storefronts, right? If you actually walk through downtown, the Exchange District, and you look at a lot of these modern buildings, the hotels, they all have concrete walls. It's amazing around Portage and Main when we rated all the blocks. So when you actually map all of that out and you map all of these different physical characteristics of streets, heights, you look at commercial activity, you look at all the characteristics in place, you realize that beyond the heritage question, it's walkable or unwalkable. And the question isn't there's the value in the building, because in some of those pink and red areas, there are heritage buildings, but why aren't they working? Well, it has nothing to do with the building 90% of the time. It has something to do with the ecosystem and the culture around it. So this plan basically is, if it was implemented, that whole map would be green within 20 years. And that's I mean, I mean, I could go through, I mean, like one of those things is that they're all measurable. I mean, I did most of this in January and February in Winnipeg. I'm in my 60s. I was riding around in my bicycle in the depths of winter in Winnipeg at 20 and 30 below, taking pictures and doing measurements and looking at applying these kinds of things. And it was a fun time. And then I figured, oh, this isn't working. So we got working groups, and I would get David Pisato from the Exchange of Business, and we would go on these little hikes, and I give them each the 40 indicators, and they would do that. And once you've done it once, you never have to do it again. It doesn't change that much. So all the baselines and metrics, and what we're with each of these 40 characteristics that we measure, we can measure them annually. So we can see which ones are getting better, which ones are getting worse, and we can measure them against value uplift, assessment, the success, the number of square feet, the residential population of the area, all of those kinds of things. So I one of the things that this was paid for mostly by the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, but like one of the things I'm trying to get is this kind of approach to it. Brings everyone together, right? It brings the economic development people together. It brings the transportation people together. It brings the economic investment people together. And this should be the foundation for a conference. Like if I was in the National Trust right now, I would be calling Mary Rowe at the Canadian Urban Institute and people at Land Development. I'd call Bryce Alston and the people who are doing really progressive development, who are all networked across the country. So we're going to have a conference, because we want to talk about 21st century buildings. We want to know the fact that so many of our office buildings, just by the virtue of being office buildings right now, are obsolete. But it's not an office building issue. You got to repurpose all kinds of buildings, and a lot of them are heritage buildings. So can we all come together, because the repurposing, which is going to be the biggest threat to heritage, is going to be the obsolescence of many of the kinds of buildings that we have, not just heritage buildings. So that could be a kickoff point for this. And if we all went and did this together, or some version of it, we would have the foundation. We'd have all the data we need to have the baselines, we'd have the metrics. We'd know what kinds of interventions and what kinds of characteristics work in what ways on that. So and I'm a great believer in, because these areas were built as precincts. They weren't built as one-offs. And it's really interesting when you go back and delayer, take the peels off the onion. You understand when in Winnipeg those 11 bank towers went up. They all went up in a very short period of time. Do you know what I mean? Where other classes of buildings didn't. Like one of the characteristic buildings in Toronto are what I call the Travelers Hotels, which are quite famous. Now I'm going to forget the Broadview right now, the Gladstone, the Winchester. These are all these glorious Victorian-looking buildings, but they were built from as early as the 1820s up until about the early 2000s. But they're a class of buildings, and why they were built, and why they were all built in this classic Victorian style, even though they were built over a 100-year period of time, tells you something different about what was happening in those neighborhoods at different points. And it was interesting in Toronto that, in the Cabbagetown neighborhood in the 1910s, they were doing stuff that had happened over in the Roncesvalles area in the 1830s, and the same kind of structure in hotels. So what was happening in patterns of urban development? So one of these sets of things were assets that were required in a neighborhood when it got to a certain point. So there were certain characteristics which tells you that the conditions were evolving. And then you can sort of project to today, okay, so what's happened in this neighborhood? Well, Cabbagetown isn't a working class neighborhood anymore. Houses are all over $1 billion, and the entire nature of what the neighborhood is and how it works is different. So heritage has to work, and what you can do with heritage. But if you don't have that kind of contextual understanding, it's very hard to do that kind of work.
So one of the things that we're interested in investigating is the utility of our sort of traditional heritage tools. And so you've talked about buildings, you've talked about sort of districts, you've alluded to designation and things that are not designated. So I'm wondering how you see designation, so our probably core tool in order to identify heritage. Is that helpful or unhelpful?
I think it's obsolete. I don't think it's helpful or unhelpful. I think it's kind of inert. It's annoying. It's created a narrative today that when you designate a building, so I live in a heritage building in Winnipeg. It was built in 1911, Bridgman. It's a classical Edwardian 3-story walk-up, stained glass windows. It's just oak and hardwood maple floors. But it's not. They don't want to designate it. which is really ridiculous, you know? When you move in there, the head of the condo association of all 28 units hands you this beautiful, they hired a historian to tell you the story of the building and the Brussels and what it was and the courtyard and the unique thing and how the heating and cooling's passed. It's a passive building. My bedroom in Winnipeg, when it's 35 degrees out, is never more than about 16 or 17 degrees. It's super cool because the building was designed, not with a courtyard just for aesthetics, but the whole building was designed to stay cool. And, you know, in Winnipeg, it's very cold in the winter and very hot in the summer, and it's very hard to stay cool. I never turned an air conditioner on. One day I lived in that through any summer. So, I mean, the whole building is interesting, and now they're doing things that are going to destroy that. And they can't even think about their building and the fireplaces and the courtyard as being the HVAC system, because we've lost. We now have a whole movement, Passive House Canada, that's actually teaching you how to build buildings using 100-year-old techniques. And all of our original movie theaters and vaudeville playhouses all had natural heating cooling systems. So, I mean, it's sort of ironic that we were now trying to reinvent that while we were destroying those buildings, destroying those systems. But designating them isn't the issue. It's understanding them. And there isn't enough work being put in understanding them as buildings. It's not about the aesthetics of the building only. These buildings are important because they worked. Matter of fact, these buildings were built more for the future now than they were for the past, because mass consumption of fossil fuels and building new buildings out of concrete is not going to be on. And a lot of our building needs are going to have to be accommodated within existing buildings and existing neighborhoods. And we have to understand those systems. And one of the things you don't want to destroy isn't just the elements of the building, but, you know, but understanding that. And if you talk to Passive House, like I bring Passive House in it, like Chris Ballard, another former environment in Ontario, is the CEO of Passive House, and he and I are building a net zero hotel right now at the airport. And we joked the other day that this looks more like a 1910 era theater. I pulled out these things and I said, you know, in Winnipeg, this was a theater that was torn down, and this is how. He said, well, that's Passive House. That's exactly how you do air exchange in that. So when I say we've lost the knowledge of city building, like these, we've really lost it, and we've lost the idea of even understanding the dynamics of how the aesthetics work to make us feel safe, welcome, and warm. So let's drive that. So, but can you imagine, Patricia, turning the heritage movement on its head and say, we're not here to make the case for salvaging and subsidizing buildings. We're here to make the case that value uplift, that you cannot rebuild your city and you cannot grow your tax base without heritage buildings, and seeing them as assets and understanding that these are living assets that have to be seen as part of streetscapes and part of an ecological whole. And if you ever remove them, your city would be not just boring and dry, it would be less walkable, and it would be an environmentally poor area. So we're in the business of mobilizing our assets across the country and working with them.
So final question, how do you think the heritage field needs to evolve to broaden its impact and influence on both government and the general public?
Well, I don't think it's the general public. I would cast myself more narrowly. I would go to where in Canada heritage matters. Okay, so there's certain cities that I would say, by the classic definition of heritage buildings, because of the presence of them, those cities are open to and understanding. And that's where the heritage building as an economic factor for urban renewal, success, and rebuilding economies, dealing with poverty, dealing with homelessness, dealing with tourism, dealing with walkability, dealing with safe streets, how those buildings function as leading components and elements of that urban ecosystem, and how they're understood is going to be consequential. So you're not going to influence government. It's not that important. It hasn't been, won't be, not in my lifetime. I spent a lot of time at the cabinet table as one of the most fierce, heritage advocates, and it just is never going to register. So don't bother. You don't need them. You only need government if you believe that there's a problem that needs subsidizing. What you need government to do is to actually shift its program structure to enabling to remove the barriers to reinvestment in in existing neighborhoods because it's beyond heritage. Like right now, we massively subsidize sprawl. And the biggest thing that's destroying our cities, I can tell you, is the ratio of land and infrastructure for every job in every household. And we use more infrastructure and more land to house people and jobs. And the biggest difference is those neighborhoods like the one we've been talking about in Winnipeg, or where I live in Toronto as well, I have homes in both cities, are the very epitome of the height of our expression of city building. That's when we applied knowledge most generously and most completely to city building. And that's what the movement needs to be about. It needs to be a movement that goes beyond heritage and is definite, but is a movement about livability and complete cities, and understanding the importance psychologically, emotionally of sense of place, and coming up with a definition of a living building that is a culturally living building. So how does culture live in a building? And buildings are going to change. There are too many of them because they're demolished, but they're going to change. So how does the culture of a building, its identity, its narrative, its architecture, its functions, its important sense of place, continue? How does that continue to be part of the discussion about the whole area, not just within the walls of the building, but outside the walls of the building, and how that building creates the context for it, right? Because the area I live in, Toronto, was really defined by Dominion Brewery, the largest brewery in the country, and the Gooderham Worts Distillery, the largest distillery in the British Empire at the time. But you would not know if you walked from the distillery at the south end of that neighborhood to the Dominion exactly what that meant, because what's interesting is all the areas that people want to live in, the places that people walk, where all the successful shops and restaurants are the areas that were, and the schools are the areas in which were not touched, or when they were, the infill buildings were done very sensitively, and not just it was sensitive to heritage, but sensitive to all of those characteristics that make a neighborhood livable, and understanding the authenticity of place here, and what are the things that are authentic and true about this place, and the way it works, and the way it looks, and how it's understood, and how you experience it, how you move in it, the purpose and what the economy is, and what that economy, what people do for a living, and how it works, what preserves that. Like the idea of putting the big Indigenous cultural, economic, and health center in the middle of this neighborhood when I was the MPP was very conscious, because we knew it would create activities around it that would sustain and preserve the neighborhood, that wouldn't be hostile. The decision right across the street to put in a data center where no one works and no one lives, and put up 4 blank walls on 4 sides, was hugely destructive, because it cut the distillery district off from Berkeley Street and King Street. So if you actually go to Mill Street and you look at the Indigenous Center and the development there, and you go 2 blocks down to, that's Mill and Cherry. If you go to Mill and Parliament, you'll see the bank data center. And you walk around that data center and you will know, even though there's a subway going in across the street and where the first Parliament site is, which is not being celebrated, nothing that's ever good is going to ever happen there, right? It's too big a dead zone, and it's nothing but walls. No one works there. It's an ugly building. It's like the Berlin block, I call it, because it's a block long Berlin Wall. But if you look at the Indigenous Center, you look at the architecture, and you look at what's going to happen there, that's going to be an explosive catalyst for activity and for the livability, and for breaking back heritage and way. Because when we did that, the elders came down and they looked at the building and they said, you have to put it here because this is the last piece of real land. They knew that the river, which is now far away, used to come right up there, and they didn't want, for a whole bunch of reasons, to build on what wasn't land. They said, what's happening behind this building isn't land. And then they talked about the looking east, and they talked about the composition, and they talked about the shape of the building. But I say to people, if you want to understand what I believe in, go and look at the Indigenous Center, which is a commercial. There's condos there, there's residential development. It's not a big government subsidized project. And then go and look at the data center and look at what kind of decision-making process does that. So what we're fighting for is living cities. We're fighting for evidence-based decision-making. It's the heritage, it's our heritage and knowledge of city building and the application of it, which is what the movement should be about. It's not about specific structures. And I would love to be part of that.
You have been a wonderful guest. Thank you so much for sharing this really rich insight and encouraging and provoking thoughts about the heritage community, but also most importantly how to build communities that work. And I'm very grateful to you, Glen Murray, for joining me today. Thank you. Heritage is Living is produced in English and in French and is available wherever you listen to your podcasts. Follow us on your favorite podcast platform to never miss an episode as we explore how heritage conservation is more than you think.